What's up, everybody? My name is Jordan. If you know me through Twitch, you probably know me as I'm Jerman, and today we're going to talk about an interesting conversation I had with a friend about tank design in World of Warcraft and MMOs in general, and whether the concept of threat is outdated and what we should be doing to make tanking more interesting. I don't know how I feel about it. So before we begin with the more theoretical and nerdy discussion on what we're going to talk about today, I think it's important that we have a common definition of terms for our video. So that's not any less nerdy, but that's the way I wanted to open this, I guess. So when I talk about threat as a concept in an MMO or World of Warcraft, I mean it as a measure of an NPC's aggression towards a particular player. Each monster you fight in an MMO, whether it's in the open world or in a dungeon or a raid, has a threat table, and the character that is at the highest position on that threat table, whoever is first on the monster's threat table, will be attacked by the monster. So put simply, and not as technical and nerdy as this, the tank in your raid is the one that is doing the most threat. You want the tank to get hit by all the monsters, so it's not hitting your DPS or your healer and killing them. Your tank's job is to be at the highest of that threat table so that the NPC attacks them. There's a variety of ways that they do that, and we're going to talk about whether these tables inherently are a fun idea or whether we should just go something as plain as monsters attacks tanks. But before we jumped into all of that, I wanted to make sure that we understood that threat is the calculation of how a monster perceives who is the most dangerous and decides who to attack based on that. When threat goes wrong, it can be a really challenging experience. If the monster starts attacking a DPS character or a healer, your tank has to manage that scenario and get the monster properly focused back on them. Likewise, your DPS player, and to a lesser extent your healers, have to mitigate the risk of threat management by doing less heals per second or damage per second. That's a pretty interesting and diverse mechanic. Do less of this thing and do more of this thing. Well, maybe it's not as interesting or diverse as I probably thought it was. After all, what's fun about telling a DPS player to do less damage or telling a healer, hey, heal me a little bit less? If your mage can do 1,000,000 damage, why should you tell them to do 900,000 instead? Why should we be asking players to do less of their job just so that the monsters attack who we intuitively feel like they should attack? What's inherently exciting about having a tank generate enough threat that the rest of the party can do its job? What's exciting about a mathematical formula to tell you about who a mob is going to attack? In a raid environment, you often hear tanks talk about how the job is relatively simple once you learn the pathing and positioning for the fight. On a fight that takes about 100 pulls to get down, tanks can typically learn their positioning relatively quickly compared to the time it takes the rest of the raid to do their job. There are often more mechanics designed for healers and DPS than there are mechanics designed for a tank, simply because the tank has the important job of making sure the boss doesn't ruin everyone else's experience. Once you get that stuff down, there isn't really much else for a tank to do, so they can spend 70 to 80 pulls just really doing nothing. What if instead of mechanics like threat, we designed raid mechanics that were more interesting for tanks? More abilities for ad management, maybe make it necessary for a tank to intervene on behalf of a DPS player from taking a large amount of damage, so whether they soak it or whether they use a cooldown that gives them some of their health for a temporary time, or maybe even there are abilities that the boss has that are unhealable that require a tank to manage its cooldowns properly. Maybe the boss says, hey, you're going to lose half your health for the rest of the encounter, making your cooldowns more important. That's a bad design and not necessarily a totally comprehensive one, but you get where I'm going with this, that maybe we can do more for tank design and tank fun than just, hey, generate this threat, stand there and get healed, and occasionally swap off of each other and give each other threat. This does beg the question, though, that if MMOs went down this road of eliminating threat, we have to still wonder, who should the mob attack? If we do away with threat, what replaces it? What do we do when a DPS attacks the boss and the boss is already attacking the tank and maybe it's a bit much? Well, to me, these are easy questions. The monster would target the designated main tank unless someone else taunts off of it, intentionally, affirmatively taunts off of it. The game already distinguishes between tanks, healers, and DPS for some mechanics, so why not just have the monster always target the main tank unless, again, the player affirmatively makes a decision to have it not do that and attack them instead? Now, This all being said, there are mechanics and other pieces of content that are designed around threat, and they're quite well done too. In Mythic Plus, for example, the affix skittish makes it so that mobs ignore threat and increase the risk of DPS and healers pulling aggro from the tank. In a Mythic Plus environment, this makes more sense because of all the jobs that a tank has. It's way more of a diverse environment than, say, a raid. Tanks have to concern themselves with pathing, mob percentage management, the sheer number of ads present in a dungeon. Tanks are often seen as the de facto leader of the dungeon, and they have to keep pace to finish the key timely. These same tank mechanics aren't really a factor in raids, and because of this, the distinction's necessary between the two. So maybe it's possible that we keep threat and threat management and things like that inside of a mechanic like raids, or of a mechanic like dungeons, as opposed to a mechanic or content piece like raids. Now, it's also possible that we keep threat and add the things I'm talking about. After all, it's possible to have both things, more interesting mechanics for tanks, and this mechanic that's less interesting but still serves a critical role in our PvE experience. But again, that brings me back to my earlier point. Why is threat management an inherently core thing? Why is it a thing that we concern ourselves with at all? As a DPS player, I want to do the most DPS possible and not risk pulling threat from the tank. Now, a fair counter argument to that is that in modern World of Warcraft, it's pretty much a non-entity. It's extremely uncommon in raids today that I'm ripping threat from the tank, even as a top DPS player on the charts. That only begs the question further of why does this mechanic exist at all, then if it's being nerfed into the ground. The one mechanic tanks have to concern themselves primarily with is threat, as we've already discussed. But if it's so meaningless that it's not really an issue for threat management, what exactly is the point? Now, at the start of the video, I mentioned that I don't exactly have an opinion on this either way, and I'm mostly just thinking out this conversation, and that's still true. And the reason that I'm not sure I want to delete threat is because it gets very tricky when it comes to things like ads and random spawns throughout dungeons and raids. Do ad spawns automatically go straight to tanks, or is it still possible for them to attack DPS players who aren't patient enough to wait for the tank to round them up? Is it fun for the tank to have to round up mobs? Probably. These are all balance and design questions, though, that can probably easily be solved. But whenever I start to side with the discussion of eliminating threat, I keep coming back to the idea that I like games to be hard. If threat management is hard and there's a small chance of messing up a pull, I like having the game plan around that. Threat has such a little impact in the game anyway that it's probably okay to keep this small but sometimes impactful mechanic and also add more interesting mechanics as well. Ultimately, I really don't know. That's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button and the subscribe button so you can be informed when new videos go live. If you didn't like it, drop me a comment down below. Let me know why. What do you think about tank design? What do you think about threat? Are you thinking I'm crazy? Let me know down in the comments below. If you want to discuss this more in real time, we can do that over my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/I'mYourMan. There's going to be a link down there in the description below where I stream every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings. With Shadowlands coming up, it's going to be a great time to jump on for the ride. But in the meantime, thank you everybody and happy gaming.